Have you noticed symbols that say ABS or a picture of a car about to skid show up when you attempt to turn on your car? Have you wondered what these symbols represent? Or if you know what they represent, have you been curious about how those driver assist systems like the ABS and traction control work? Hello, folks. My name is Aditya, and welcome to Vehicle Dynamics Lectures. In the next set of videos dedicated to tires, we will answer these questions and more. Now, when I started learning about tires, I simply couldn't understand all the fuss surrounding it in the vehicle dynamics community. To me, it was just this black, lackluster piece of rubber that I couldn't care less about. Perhaps you too are on the same boat. So let's motivate the need to learn tires with a concrete example. Imagine you're an engineer in a company that takes pride in building fast and agile cars. Your team has built a car and it's getting close to launch time. Your company hires test drivers. They take it around a track to see how it performs. It turns out the performance is not as good as your competitor's vehicle. Now, this has gotten the management worried. It's too late to go back to the drawing board to redesign the car because you have a launch coming up soon. We have to do something quick. So you start off by looking at the report prepared by your test drivers. You notice that among all the tests performed, the car suffers majorly in the moose test. So, what is a moose test and what does it tell us in terms of car performance? The moose test is essentially a double lane change maneuver that tests a vehicle's ability to evade a suddenly appearing obstacle on the road. Apparently, this term came out of Sweden, where automakers were perhaps interested in knowing how good their cars were at avoiding mooses. A little more scientifically, this test measures how fast a car can yaw and also how stable it is when performing maneuvers with very large yaw rates. Now that we know what the moose test is and where our car needs to improve, let's lay down a few potential solutions. Okay, maybe we can incorporate rear wheel steering. That should definitely help increase max yaw rate. But I guess I cannot do so because our launch is coming up soon and this would require some work on design and hardware to allow the rear wheels to actuate. What about torque vectoring? What if I optimally distribute braking torques between wheels to generate more yaw? So if I'm trying to take a left turn, I could send more braking torque to my inner rear wheel. It'll essentially act as a pivot and give me the yaw rate I desire. Now that sounds like a plan to me. So let's try to see what the inputs and outputs to the torque vectoring algorithm looks like. The torque vectoring algorithm that we want to build for our use case here will take in two inputs, the desired yaw rate and desired deceleration. It will spit out torques that need to be sent to each of the four wheels. And as you might have imagined, it also needs tire info along with the physical properties of the car to compute an optimal set of brake torques. Tire info essentially tells the algorithm how much torque a given tire can realize. Hopefully, that gives you good enough motivation to learn more about tires. So, what are we waiting for? Let's talk tires. When vehicle dynamists typically discuss tires, they are often interested in the tire's ability to generate friction. Of course, there are other aspects of interest to the tire, but this is usually the centerpiece. Before we delve into the friction generation mechanism in tires and see how we might be able to model them, let's unlearn or in some ways debunk a few myths associated with friction. To do this, let's talk about the Coulomb friction model. Some of you watching might have come across this model in high school physics or undergrad mechanics classes. It's a model that works pretty well for smooth, rigid body interactions. So for example, if you want to model the friction experienced by a metallic block on a wooden table, this would be a good model to use. Let's try to see what some of its limitations are and in the process unlearn a few things before we delve into the world of tire friction. So let's say you have a block of mass m on a table and you are trying to push it. What are the forces acting on the block? There is gravity pulling it down, a normal force denoted by N opposing the force of gravity and keeping it from falling down. U pushing the block with a force P, and friction denoted by F acting to counteract the motion or impending motion of the block. Coulomb's prediction was that if you keep increasing the force you apply on a stationary block, the friction force also increases to try and keep the block at rest. In other words, friction adjusts to the force you are applying up to a certain limit. After that, it drops slightly and remains a constant. The region where the frictional forces increase with the force you apply is called the static region. So all the way till it hits that maxima. After the maxima, where the friction force remains independent of the force you apply, is the kinetic region. And Coulomb claimed the force at the maxima equals μs, which is the static coefficient of friction times the normal reaction experienced by the block. And the force in the kinetic region, or the region where the force remains fairly constant, is μk, which is the kinetic coefficient of friction times the normal reaction experienced by the block. So in summary, these are some of the main comments this model makes about friction. Friction is self-adjusting. So up until the peak of the static regime, the friction force matches or adjusts to the force you apply. It is independent of surface area, static friction is usually greater than kinetic friction, and frictional forces depend only on the normal reaction between two surfaces. Before we talk about friction in viscoelastic materials, that is tires, let's systematically debunk some of the fallacies of this model. First up, friction is self-adjusting. This is more or less true, so nothing to unlearn here. Second point is that friction is independent of surface area. This is not entirely true, and we'll see in later lectures that friction is indeed a surface phenomena and does depend on the surface area of contact. Does that make the Coulomb model useless? No, this assumption works well for some contacts, like between smooth rigid bodies. Friction is only dependent on the normal force between two objects. Oh boy, I wish this was true. We will soon see how friction in tires is dependent on a whole host of other parameters. Static friction is greater than sliding friction, or slipping is just bad for grip. This is also not quite true, and we will see in the future lectures that a certain amount of slip is in fact necessary to generate forces in tires. Kind of like how you need to have a certain amount of bacteria in your gut for its proper functioning, but also you don't want a ton of it. So, what do we learn? We motivated the need to study tires through a case study on the failed Moose test, which forced us to design a torque vectoring controller. We walked through the Coulomb's model of friction and understood some of its drawbacks. It also helped us debunk a few myths about friction. That brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you for watching, and if you find these helpful, do like and subscribe. See you in the next.